Well, if you're watching this video, it is probably because you are in one of my church history classes. And I want to give you a little bit of a orientation to what we're going to be doing in this class. And I want to do that by giving you two assumptions that I have about history. First, let me say I love teaching the church history classes. I love the systematic theology as well because I love the truth that we get to dive into. I love looking at scripture. But there's something about the church history classes that the way in which we learn is I find just a lot of fun. So I love the energy that happens in the church history classes and the discussion. I hope and pray that it is an enjoyable, exciting experience for you. Glad you're in the class. But let me just orient you a little bit to what we're going to do. I think if you have a proper expectation of what we're going to do in this class, it's just going to help make it a better experience. And let me give you two ways in which I understand history. First, history I think of as a story, right? History is not just about names and dates and places, and no, it's about an unfolding drama. It's about something happened that caused something else to happen, that caused something else to happen, and we want to understand it as this ongoing, unfolding story. That's the best way to understand it. So what that means is that in my class, I'm going to spend a good bit of time telling you the story of church history for a particular time period. We're not just going to give you the names and dates, important people, ask you to memorize them. No, I'm going to talk about it as a story. And then part of your homework and part of the way that I test you is I'm going to ask you to really give that story back to me. I'm going to ask you for a one-page summary of the story of church history that we've talked about for that period of time. And I'm going to ask you to give it in a narrative form, which means I'm not saying give me a bunch of names and dates and give me a list. I'm not asking for a list. I'm asking you to narrate the story of church history, based upon what we talked about in the class lecture. That's one of the assignments that you'll do every week. I'm asking for one page typed. It's going to be about 400 words or so, explaining the story of church history during that time. I don't think that this is going to take you a long time. I'm not asking you to do any extra research outside of the lecture. Just asking you to take the lecture after you've listened to it in class, taken some notes, and then revise your notes such that you are explaining it in a story format. This is also how I test you for the final, because each week you're going to do a small story of the church history we did during that time, and then for the final I'm going to ask you to do the whole thing. So the final will be you write the story of church history from the time of the class started until the time period where the class ends. And if you can't do that, I would just ask you, well, what did you learn during this time? So the fact that you've sat through a 3-credit class for an entire semester, I expect you to be able to narrate from the beginning of that period of church history till the end. And when I ask you to do that, I'm also asking you to be selective, right? You can't say everything that was discussed in class. So I'm asking you to try to think about what are the most important things, the highlights, what are the main events, and how did those main events contribute to what came after it and shape the flow of history. Okay, so that's one of my assumptions, that history is a story. That means I'm going to try to tell it as a story, and I'm going to test you on your understanding of it as a story. The test will not be names and dates. The tests will be, can you tell me the story of church history that we looked at in class? The second assumption I have about church history is that, or history in general, is that primary sources are very, very important. So the other thing I'm going to ask you to do in this class is each week you're going to read a primary source. That primary source is a source from the period of history that we're covering, something that was written by an eyewitness, by a person in this period, not something written recently that reflects back on that time. No, that's something that was current with the time that we're actually studying. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to read that source. It's going to be posted on Schoology, and then give me a summary of what that source said. Now, I'll give you fair warning. Some of these sources will be a bit challenging for you to read. I am not expecting you to have 100% comprehension. I'm okay with you getting some of it, but not all of it. We are going to discuss each source in class the week after you have actually written it. So it'll be due on a couple days before the actual class meets. You're going to submit it via Schoology. Then I'm going to have a little bit of time to look at it. And then when we get to class, the first thing we're going to do is discuss the source that you interacted with. I'm okay if you missed some things. I've even had it where most all of the class kind of misses the main part of what the source is actually saying. I want you to try your best. I want you to give it a good shot, but I'm not expecting you to master these sources. And we're going to clear things up in class. But here, the assumption behind this is a couple things. One is that in order for us to do proper history, we've got to go back to the primary sources. I mean, you could read anything in a textbook. There's all kinds of errors that go out in textbooks. And people just sometimes believe them because, that's what the historian said in the textbook. But unless you can go back to the primary source, you're just at the mercy of whatever the history textbook says. I'm trying to teach you how to go back to the primary sources and try to learn history and see history for yourself. I want to try to equip you to do that. So, that's part of the reason why I want to train you to read primary sources. The other thing is that I think when we read old literature, it helps us to grow in wisdom. And we'll talk about this on the first day of class. C.S. Lewis talks about the value of reading old books. And he says that that what old books do is it's not that they don't have errors in them. They abound with errors. The thing is, we can usually spot those errors because we come from a different time. We have different blind spots. But see, as we can spot the errors in old books because, we see things differently, the old books can help sort of reveal the errors that we have and the blind spots that we have. So when we read old books, it helps us to maybe see some of the blind spots that we have in us. Also, old books help us grow in wisdom because sometimes they're written at a level that challenges us. They're exposing us to a whole domain of understanding that we haven't thought of. And the act of reading them sort of lifts us to a greater understanding. We grow in wisdom by reading them, by struggling and wrestling with the text to try to understand what it says. If I just gave you a history textbook that covered these areas of church history that we're going to look at this semester, you probably could learn a greater quantity of facts because it would be easier reading. You could just read it through, it would make sense, and you could just learn, in some sense, more facts about church history. But I'm not interested just that you know the most facts because, from my own experience, I just forget them pretty quickly, unfortunately. I'm also wanting you to grow in wisdom. So, we're not going to cover as much breadth of material, but I'm hoping to focus more on some depth and expose you to writings that will help you grow, that will help you learn how to do history for yourself even, but also help you grow as a person, as a Christian, as a church leader. So those are a few things behind the class that you're about to take. Look forward to walking this class with you. Thanks.